audiobooks in European politics. I'm Tim Jones, and my guest today is Simon Shuster, author of The Showman, the inside story of the invasion that shook the world and made a leader of Volodymyr Zelensky, published today by HarperCollins. Ukraine watchers have been waiting for the release of this book since Time magazine started teasing chapters in November. And before that, going all the way back to April 2022, when the magazine published Inside Zelensky's World, an account by Simon of 2 weeks holed up in the presidential compound with Zelensky and his senior staff during the first months of the full-scale war. Born in Moscow but raised in California, Simon has reported from Russia and Ukraine for 17 years. Before joining Time magazine, he worked in the region for the Moscow Times, Reuters, and AP. He first met Ukraine's war leader and his entourage when Zelensky ran for president in 2019, and clearly built enough trust to be granted wartime access at the highest levels, based on conversations with Ukrainian principals on and off the record, including the president, his wife, their childhood friends, his chief of staff, his defense minister, his national security advisor, and the chief of staff of the armed forces. The Showman provides a unique insight into the conduct of the war. So Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Before we get to the meat of the book, can you tell us more about your Russian origins, your family's move to the US, and what it was that pulled you back to Russia?
So I was born in 1983 in the Soviet Union, in a suburb of Moscow. And my family moved to the United States as refugees in 1989 when I was 6 years old. Our family is, half Ukrainian, half Russian. My mom's side is, her father is Russian, her mom is Ukrainian, grew up in Kyiv. My dad grew up in central Ukraine in Khmelnytsky, in a little Jewish shtetl that he loved to talk about. So when we moved, settled in San Francisco, which is quite a contrast to Soviet Moscow of 1989, and I grew up in San Francisco, and there was quite a vibrant Russian-speaking community, mostly Ukrainian. I'd say the plurality were from Odessa, actually, from that one city, because mostly Jewish emigres, Jewish refugees coming in that wave in the early 90s. And a lot of my friends growing up were Russian-speaking. At home, we spoke Russian. So I had the language, which in journalism is absolutely priceless. So when I understood in college that I wanted to become a journalist, I also understood that my competitive advantage would be my language. So I set my sights on this English language newspaper in Moscow called the Moscow Times. This was in 2006. And I moved there, and my job interview with the then editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times was about 30 seconds long. He said, do you speak Russian? I said, yes. He said, okay, move to Moscow, we'll teach you the rest. So I had that advantage. I also had relatives. I still have relatives around Moscow. At the time when I moved there in 2006, they helped me kind of get settled and get my bearings. But yeah, that's sort of the short version.
And when did you leave Moscow?
I left in 2013 as a correspondent for Time magazine. They moved me to Berlin to cover the European Union. But my focus remained on Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine. I continued traveling all the time. 2014, I spent basically living in Ukraine because, there was the revolution, then there was the annexation of Crimea, then the war in the Donbass. So I had an apartment that year in Berlin. That's where I was technically based. But I was in Ukraine the whole time.
And how did you get into Zelensky world?
Well, I've been covering Ukraine and Russia for 17 years now. And Zelensky is the third Ukrainian president I've interviewed and profiled in the presidential compound on Bankova Street. So when he announced his candidacy, it was quite a natural thing for me to tell my editors, hey, there's this comedian, he's running for president, and he's gaining in the polls pretty fast. We shouldn't ignore his campaign. And they found it kind of like a funny story, so they agreed to send me down there. I profiled him during his campaign. And backstage of his comedy show, I met a lot of his friends, advisors, fellow comedians, who then moved with him into the presidential administration when he won the elections in the spring of 2019. So that allowed me to, continue staying in touch with them. I developed some relationship during the campaign when they were very, very new to politics. And then as they continued to govern, I stayed in close touch with them. I continued writing articles about Ukrainian politics, about Zelensky's administration, about his failures, his successes. And that put me in quite a unique position when the invasion started, to come to him and say, look, you know me, I know you. I would like to write a book about what's happening here. What do you think? And are you open to that? And, he was, I wouldn't say super enthusiastic, but he's like, yeah, I mean, somebody should. And said, yeah, I know you, so go for it. And the conversation was kind of like that. It wasn't very detailed or enthusiastic on his part.
I mean, you clearly had extraordinary access, and you also clearly have sympathy towards Zelensky, but you're not uncritical. And for example, you praise him as, quote, brave to the point of recklessness.
Yeah.
But you also call him, quote again, stubborn, confident, vengeful, and impolitic. And towards the close of the book, you express this nagging worry that power may become addictive for him. How has this gone down in Kyiv?
I mean, it depends who you ask, I guess. There are certainly people on social media, I see their remarks and comments, who seem to believe that any criticism, any diversion from the kind of official government line of how the war is going is seen to some of these people online as some kind of betrayal. So there are opinions like that, that's fine. I think it's a bit sad that the discourse in Ukraine has come to that it's so black and white, that any criticism is seen as verging on treason or sympathy for Russia or something like that, right? But I'd say, in the presidential administration, they're grown-ups. They know who I am. They never had any illusions that I was working for them or part of their team. They know I'm an independent journalist. My articles, while writing the book, I was publishing articles, some of which were critical of him. Sometimes they didn't like those articles, and there would be strains in our relationship, and I would feel that they were kind of pushing me out for a couple of weeks here or there. But that's part of the working process. They respect my work. They know my work. They knew my work going into this project. My articles about Zelensky's administration from the very beginning were not all rosy. And I certainly also gave the microphone to many of his enemies, political enemies, in Ukraine, and he didn't always like that. But he's mature enough and has enough respect for journalism to not close me out.
I mean, I noticed when the teaser came out in November in Time, you got a lot of pushback from some Ukrainians. We'll come back to that because that's actually relevant towards the end of the book. But for now, let's go back to the opening chapter and your account of the first night of the invasion. And the first days are really compelling. How Zelensky rushed back into the city, the key role of the Speaker of Parliament. And there's one vignette of one of his senior staff saying goodbye to his wife. Both of them believe it's going to be forever. Can you paint us a picture of those first few hours and days?
Oh, it was very chaotic, very frightening. There was no real plan. They were winging it. And as I write in the book, he learned about the invasion the morning before sunrise, and he rushed to the offices there on Bankova Street in the government district of Kyiv, just because that's the seat of presidential power. So he felt that, if he's going to be a wartime leader, he's got to be in his office there where he belongs. And he told his aides to go to the same place. Some of them were expecting, when they arrived, an organized evacuation. Some of them arrived with their families and their luggage in their cars outside. And, to some of these advisors, to all the ones who wanted to leave, Zelensky's position was basically, that's fine, as long as you ask for permission, and as long as your intention is to get your family out and then come back to work. That was sort of the idea, and a lot of people did that. Half of the ministers in the government left to Western Ukraine to establish a kind of base of operations for the government, just in case Kyiv were to fall. But I spoke to a lot of people who were there. There were a lot of dramatic moments that they described. Andrei Sibicha, you mentioned him saying goodbye to his wife. That was one. I think the most dramatic that I was able to come across in my reporting was actually with one of Zelensky's dear friends, Denis Monastyrsky, who was the Minister of Interior, Minister of Internal Affairs, and he was in charge of the police and the border guards and the National Guard. He was tragically killed in January 2023, about a year into the invasion, in a helicopter crash, an accident. And his family and his associates in the ministry got videos from his phone after he was killed, videos that he taped of himself saying goodbye to his family. And he wanted to have these recordings with him just in case he knew he was about to be killed, so he could send them and have a goodbye to his family and his young children. And his wife shared those recordings with me and allowed me to describe them and quote from them. I mean, heart-wrenching to watch. I got to know Monastyrsky while reporting this book, seeing him in those videos he made. And he just addresses his children. He says, "I love you." He gives them some advice about, how they should grow up. And these kinds of moments were playing out across the administration because, realistically, they had very good reason to fear that they will all be killed.
It's interesting what you write about Zelensky, though, that you say that until the final hours, he didn't believe that this could happen. And that certainly comes across in your description of that first night. And yet, Alexei Danilov, his national security advisor, was almost relieved when the missile started flying because he'd been expecting it for so long. And the American intelligence was very clear. Mm-hmm. Is Zelensky just temperamentally optimistic, or do you think he was reassured by Chancellor Scholz and President Macron, or both?
Both. I think he is temperamentally optimistic. I think he was just not inclined to believe that in the 21st century that this was possible in the center of Europe, this kind of genocidal war of aggression to take over an entire country of 44 million people. It's just phantasmagorical. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute. Yeah. So yes, he chose to believe among the range of intelligence that was presented to him, the more optimistic scenario. The Americans were presenting the most extreme scenario of what we saw in the end, a full-scale invasion with Kyiv being the main target and Zelensky being the main target. I think other intelligence services, including the Ukrainians, were predicting, in the Ukrainian military, were predicting more likely there would be an attack from the east, an escalation in eastern Ukraine, where there had been a simmering war for 8 years by that point. They expected it to come from there, and they actually, relocated some troops that were based in Kyiv and to the east in the lead up to the invasion, because that's where they expected the Russians to come from. Zelensky, he did get some reassurances from President Macron of France, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, who both spoke to Putin in the hours and days before the invasion. Putin told them that he would not invade. He was lying to the world. He was lying to everyone. But they passed those assurances along to Zelensky. I think that gave him a chance to believe that things would not be as bad as the Americans predicted.
But the American intelligence was clairvoyant, right? And you have this little throwaway line, which I haven't seen anyone pick up, but it jumped out at me, where you quote someone as saying that they had their very own Cardinal of the Kremlin, which is from this Tom Clancy book. And in that case, the Cardinal of the Kremlin was a personal aide to the defense minister. So I wondered, obviously you can't say who told you that, but do you suspect this was a double bluff on you to try and cause dissent within the Russian government?
No, I don't think so, because that conversation, that interview was at the time. So this was well before, months before the invasion started, when the Americans began making these predictions. So this wasn't a person, an official, remembering these things about a supposed, American mole inside the Kremlin. He wasn't remembering these things after the fact. This was a conversation, kind of a fresh one. And I think that's one of the things that makes the book stand out. The reporting was kind of in real time. It was done in many cases before the Ukrainians or anyone had a chance to kind of establish a narrative of what they will say happened, looking back with hindsight. So I think that gives the reporting, I hope, an immediacy that will be hard to replicate, in the future for historians who study this war. But that was a case in point. This was someone talking to me at the time who was having these conversations with the Americans, and he was like, "Yeah, they have the source. They say they have the source, so they say we should believe them because they have this, high up source in the Kremlin." But nevertheless, this person, and I'd say the bulk of the administration around Zelensky, did not believe the Americans. No.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the editor of the New Books Network, and here at the NBN, we are big fans of HNet. Many of you will know what HNet is. And you'll know in particular about HNet Commons, which is a set of well over 100 listservs on specific disciplines. Thousands and thousands of scholars all over the world post there all the time. You can probably find what you study there, and you can join one of the lists. Well, HNet needs our support and your support, and they're having their annual fundraising drive right now, and we would encourage you to contribute something. It's very easy to do. If you go to the New Books Network website and look at the red bar at the top, you'll see a link that says Support HNet. Click that, and you can make a contribution. I hope you do it today.
Yeah, some of the fly in the wall stuff is really great. I mean, I love books like that. And I want to pick up one particular chapter, which is the conversations you clearly had with the Chief of the General Staff, Volodymyr Zelensky. Yeah. And there's so much in there, but let's go first with his initial wartime contacts with his US counterpart, Mark Milley. Yeah. The Blizzard 2022 feint and his campaigns of misdirection, even with his own government and with the Americans. Can you talk us through that?
It's a complicated picture. I'm not sure I'll be able to do it justice here, but there's quite a few pages devoted to tracing the arc of this. But to really simplify it, General Zelensky in the lead up to the invasion was advocating for a more fulsome preparations, mobilization of reservists, barricading and fortifying the borders with Russia in the north, especially, and stockpiling reserves of material, including uniforms, food, ammunition, things like that. And the message he was getting, as he described it, from the president and the presidential staff was, okay, you can get prepared, but do it quietly. Don't panic people. And General Zelensky was quite frustrated with this, but also understood that he answers to the civilian leadership. So he said he was preparing, but he was doing it under these kind of, as he called them, political restrictions and looking for loopholes to prepare without causing panic. One of the things they did was move around military equipment at night rather than during the day, so that there was less of a chance of people seeing it, taking videos on their phones and posting it online that might scare the public. Anyway, the Blizzard 2022 military exercises that were officially announced in Ukraine, they involved tens of thousands of Ukrainian servicemen. They, as Zelensky explained to me, was they were an opportunity for him to move forces into position with a cover story, right? We're just doing exercises. These exercises have long been planned. On the Facebook page of the General Staff, they put some very innocuous sounding reason for these exercises. So nothing to see here kind of approach. In reality, they were moving forces into position, in many cases hiding them, so that the Russian attack could not catch soldiers asleep in their beds in their garrisons, and they could not catch the most valuable and important air defenses and other military equipment in their usual bases. So there's a wonderful quote that I love from General Zelensky in the book. He said something to the effect of, "We needed the enemy to believe that we were in our usual bases, smoking grass, posting on Facebook, and watching TV." That was
what I normally do, right?
I mean, I don't know, but he didn't go that far. But that was the strategy, yeah, and it was successful because the Russians began their invasion with massive aerial bombardment and artillery bombardment of strategic sites, command posts, air defense locations, military bases, and I think that decision and that strategy on the part of General Zelensky, he deserves a lot of credit for the survival of the Ukrainian military, their ability to survive that initial wave of the attack and then to start pushing back.
Is he always that open with reporters, or was this unusual?
Unusual. I mean, I think at that point, So I guess you're asking about my access to General Zelensky and how that worked. Yeah. So I happened to be quite close with his aide-de-camp, so his right hand. His aide, who's also quite a prominent character in the book, Alexei Noskov, who's a colonel there in the Ukrainian armed forces. I knew Noskov for a long time. I mean, more than a year before the invasion. We stayed in touch, and when the invasion started, he was the main aide, the chief aide to General Zelensky when it came to information warfare and kind of publicity. So when the general finally decided to give an interview, when he finally found time in his schedule to do that, he was of course inundated with interview requests. When he finally decided, okay, fine, I'll talk to someone. Noskov called me. And in the beginning of the interview, and I quote this in the book, Zelensky said, I'm going to tell you all this once, and then I'm not going to tell it again. So he wanted to get it on the record, what happened, but he didn't show any desire to do a kind of a media tour and start going on TV. That was not his thing. He didn't particularly like that.
It may be my ignorance, but until I read your book, I didn't see such a direct link between the fall of Medvedchuk and Putin's decision to give up on his campaign of influence and destabilization and go for all-out war. Is that something that's been missing in other accounts? Is this something that you learned during the research of the book, or is it something you always knew?
Thank you so much for asking that question. Because I think, historically speaking, one of the main contributions of the book to the historical record of how we got here is that chapter about Medvedchuk and how the crackdown against Medvedchuk, who's, Putin's closest ally in Kyiv, the crackdown against Putin's closest ally in Kyiv angered Putin very much in the lead up to the invasion. And I would argue, at least coincided with his decision to invade. I can't gaze into Putin's soul and tell you exactly what he was thinking, but, the crackdown on his friend in Kyiv, Medvedchuk, the main kind of attack against Medvedchuk and his TV channels and so on came less than 2 days before the Russians began massing troops at the border. Could be a coincidence? I don't think so. So I knew about that when it was happening. I interviewed Medvedchuk at the time that he faced these attacks against his political party in Ukraine and his assets and so on. I interviewed him in Kyiv. And I published a story a few weeks before the invasion started that had most of this material. It got pretty significant attention, I would say, but I do think that it's missing from people's understanding of how we got here. And I think I'm quite happy with that chapter. It goes deep into the weeds of the lead up to the invasion from the perspective of kind of Russian-Ukrainian relations and the intricacies of politics in both countries. But it's important to understand, and I do think it gives an important layer of understanding, why the war began.
Well, and here's a similar one that, again, I don't feel has been addressed by other accounts, which is this idea that the Ukrainians turned down a peace deal in Istanbul. Now, I know this has come up recently, but I've read in other books that it was Bucha that killed these negotiations. But you write about your astonishment that Zelensky, until the last hour, gave Putin the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I think Bucha was a key factor. History rarely has, just one explanation for why history turns one way or the other. It's usually a mix of factors. So the reason that the Ukrainians essentially stopped the negotiation process with the Russians, there are a number of explanations for that. Bucha is one. When they saw the atrocities that Russians had committed, in Bucha and other parts of the Kyiv region, when the Russians withdrew from that region in the very beginning of April 2022, these atrocities came to light. They horrified and sickened Zelensky and his aides, and indeed his aides began telling him, "Boss, we can't negotiate with these monsters. We have to stop the negotiations." Zelensky, for his part, continued pushing them to continue the negotiations. I know this is horrific. I know this is genocide, but we cannot miss an opportunity to end this war, even if it's a small one. I think one factor that people miss, and that I outline in the book in some detail, that contributed to this decision to halt negotiations at that time, and this was all happening in the course of about 2 weeks. So, the book gives you the kind of chronology of how this happened. What happened was Ukraine began winning. It began winning on the battlefield. The Russians withdrew from Kyiv not as a humanitarian gesture of goodwill, but because they were defeated by the Ukrainians. At the same time, a lot more Western weaponry began arriving. That also gave a boost to the Ukrainian sense that, hey, maybe we could win this thing on the battlefield. Let's see how far we can push it. We have the momentum, right? There were a couple of other incidents. One is the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk, Putin's closest friend. That was a major boost to morale. It's hard to explain why that was so important psychologically for Zelensky and his team without understanding more about Medvedchuk. I don't think we have time to go into that here, but I would really encourage people to read about that in the book. And the other thing was a big one was the sinking of the Moskva. I believe that was I don't want to get that, but it was like either the 11th or the 14th of April 2022. That was the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. A pair of Ukrainian-made missiles, Neptune missiles, sank that ship. And that was an enormous boost to morale. I mean, huge victory, a symbolic victory. It's not going to end the war, but it showed again the Ukrainians that, hey, maybe we're not as weak as we thought. Maybe we don't really need to grant these enormous concessions that the Russians are asking for. Let's see how far we can push this on the battlefield. So that is a factor that I think is important to understand. Why the negotiations then in April of 2022 broke down.
A key part of your book is, you talk about his pre-political life and his acting troupe and his comedy and so on. You stress that when he was running for office, he was running as a uniting figure. He was a Russian speaker from the industrial heartlands, and he felt he could speak to both sides. And he came into office intending to end the war in the East, and yet he's ended up as this wartime leader. Mm. And this, of course, explains the title of the book, that you feel he's found his moment as a showman.
I'd say so, yeah. I mean, the title of the book points to the fact that his showmanship has been his superpower over the course of the invasion. He recognized very early in the opening moments, hours of the invasion, that Ukraine would not survive without massive Western support. That was clear even before the invasion. That they needed to keep the world on Ukraine's side. So in order to do that, he needed to grab and hold the attention of the world, to win the sympathy of the world. And I argue in the book that his skills as a showman, as someone extremely well versed in building narratives, constructing narratives, and controlling what we see on our screens. This was an instrumental part of his success as a wartime leader. It was instrumental to Ukraine's success because it allowed him to speak not only through these kind of secure line telephone channels to foreign leaders, but to really win the hearts and minds of the people who elected those leaders in foreign democracies across the Western world. Countries like Japan, Australia, everywhere. He spoke directly to the people, and he used his skills as an actor, as a showman, to do that, to draw on their emotions, to make them feel this war, as he put it, as their own, not some territorial dispute somewhere at the edges of Europe, but really as a war for all the values that the world's democracies espouse. So that's why I think he's a showman. He was a showman for 20 years before he became president, and that set of skills is just fundamental to his character, and it's fundamental to his success as a leader.
You clarify early on that he and Zelensky came to a division of labor. So Zelensky was out, selling the war abroad, getting weapons, getting political support, while Zelensky was running the war. But then it's clear that then he started to feel more confidence, and there were differences over strategy. How bad did it get? And is there any danger, do you think, that Zelensky could actually be replaced while the war is ongoing?
Yes, there is that danger. I think I don't know if there's a consensus in the president's office, but many people around the president understand full well how destabilizing and dangerous that would be. But I think that risk remains, that President Zelensky would change the military leadership in the middle of a war. So the relationship there between Zelensky and Zelensky is really at the center of the book. I follow it very closely for throughout the chapters, and you see the evolution of the relationship. In the beginning of the invasion, President Zelensky talked to me and talked in general about Zelensky in such admiring, glowing terms, almost as a savior of the country. I happened to sit in on a telephone conversation that President Zelensky had with General Zelensky, and just the respect in his voice when he addressed the general was really something I remember very, very clearly, and I thought was quite important. He really let the general do the fighting, because he knew that Zelensky knew that he didn't have the the strategic know-how to do this. And indeed, General Zelensky was very successful. He won the Battle of Kyiv and so on. So in that early period, Zelensky didn't interfere. All he asked, the main things he asked the generals was, what do you need? How can I help you? What support can I provide? What should I ask the Western leaders, the international leaders, to get you the help that you need? Over time, what you see in the book, I'm summarizing events that are described in some detail there, but over time, what you see is President Zelensky develops a level of confidence in his own understanding of military strategy and a set of military priorities about what needs to happen on the battlefield, when to attack, where to attack, how to use resources. And those priorities did not always align with those of the general. They took a somewhat different approach to how to wage the war, and that led to tensions. That led to disagreements, and I think fundamentally that's the reason why their relationship has not been great in recent months.
Well, I mentioned earlier the Time magazine cover in November and how controversial it was, and it was the first piece. There've been a few since then. It was the first piece I felt that really floated the idea that there is some war weariness in Ukraine and perhaps the beginnings of there being a ceasefire or settlement. How and when do you think this war will end, even temporarily?
I get that question a lot. I always try to dodge it. I'll be straight with you, because I work in the present and the recent past as a journalist. I really try to avoid prognostication. I'm terrible at it. I was wrong in predicting that Russia would not annex Crimea in 2014. I was wrong in predicting that Russia would not invade, full-scale invasion in 2022. So I'm bad at prognostication. What I do is tell you what happened, and you can make your own decisions about who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and what's going to happen next. So with that caveat, I can say that Zelensky is in no mood to negotiate. And he is attempting in recent months, I'd say starting in the summer of 2023 for sure, to kind of hedge his bets against the possibility that the Western support would continue to decline and possibly be cut off completely if and when former President Trump is reelected in the United States. So the way they're preparing for that is a massive focus and huge investments in domestic arms production. That's their kind of plan B. Zelensky, in a quote recently to the Associated Press, he said, "This is the way out." The way out meaning of the conundrum of how will you sustain the war if the West continues to curtail its support. This is the way out. So domestic production of arms. They've had an enormous amount of success, I think. And we see that success in the dramatic attacks against Russian targets in Crimea and deep inside Russian territory, from Belgorod to Moscow to Sochi. Those drones that you remember struck the Kremlin in the spring of 2023. Those were Ukrainian-made drones, and that's quite an achievement. So they're also building missiles. So all of which is to say that is the war moving to a negotiation? I think Zelensky is not ready for that, and he is looking for ways to sustain the fight, to stay in the fight, even if someone like Donald Trump comes in and tries to pressure him to negotiate. Zelensky does not like to be pressured. He, as I write, he's very stubborn. He does not like to be pushed around.
Talking to politicians and military off the record as you do you think they really want this wasteland that's in the East now, and the gangster state? Do they really want that back? I can understand why they would want Crimea back, and that they would worry about the Russians would feel emboldened having taken over 20% of the territory. But
yeah, I mean, I can only tell you what they tell me repeatedly in our conversations, and I believe them, that they see, and first and foremost President Zelensky, that freezing the war, giving up parts of the territory, and then freezing the front line somewhere in eastern Ukraine or the south would only delay the inevitable. It would give Russia a chance to regroup, rearm, to build up its forces for another attack that will, they expect, again attempt to take over the entire country, unseat Zelensky, take over the capital. They don't see Putin's war aims changing, Putin indeed has made pretty clear in some of his recent public statements that he still intends to kind of finish what we started, for what the Russians started. I think that is basically where their heads are at. I think they want to keep pushing as long as they can and to regain momentum, so that if they do end up in a negotiation, it's from a position of strength and not on the back foot.
Okay, well, final question. You write about what you call the return of politics. And this has become even more so since you finished the book, with the criticisms coming from Mayor Klitschko and the feud, which seems unending between Zelensky and Poroshenko.
Yeah.
With the caveat that you don't like to predict, where does this go next, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, in the final in the epilogue to the book, I sort of point to the concerns that I have about what Ukraine will look like after the war, after what I certainly hope will be its victory in this war. What kind of Ukraine will that be, and what kind of leader will Zelensky be? You know, how strong are his is his democratic DNA? How easy will it be for him to, for example, give private tycoons back control of their media, their television channels, and tell them, okay, you can criticize me now, go for it, knock yourself out? How easy will it be for him to return to a competitive political playing field where his enemies are free and emboldened to attack him? That'll be tough. In our conversations, he said that is his intention. He puts it very clearly and bluntly, and he has a good point, that at a time of war, the country is under martial law. That is a legal document. It's defined in law, and it forbids elections under martial law. It gives the state full control of the airwaves to wage the information war. So he says, when war ends in our victory, we will lift martial law and we'll go back to democracy as normal. But we ain't done yet. The war is still ongoing. So stop talking to me about freedom of the press and competitive elections. Read the text of martial law, and you'll see where we stand. So that's basically his position. Time will tell. I don't know. I remain somewhat concerned, but I'm also heartened by. For one thing, not to overestimate my role in history here, but for one thing, the fact that Zelensky allowed me, an independent journalist, to get the access that I had and to write a book that he still, from what I understand, hasn't read. He never asked to see it. He never asked for any kind of approval. He said, yeah, go for it, knock yourself out. So that shows a certain commitment to independent journalism, for which I'm really grateful, and which I have to acknowledge is a good sign of his kind of democratic bona fides. But we'll see. It's an open question. History shows that that's always a very difficult and fraught transition from absolute power back to democratic competition. That's tough for anybody.
Yeah. Well, to end the interview, since this is a podcast about books, as usual, I've asked my guests to recommend one broadly in the same field and one personal choice. So, Simon, what have you chosen?
I mean, the book that I had, this may be a boring choice, but the book that I had on my desk while writing it was Lenin's Tomb by David Remnick, the book about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because he had that kind of incredible access to the people involved in the final days of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev and so on. And his descriptions were, if your listeners haven't read that book yet, it's very illuminating, and it served as a kind of guide to me in writing the book, I guess, stylistically and in the journalistic approach that Remnick took to that book. I'm also a big fan and recently reread Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbottom, which is really a deep dive and an amazing work of journalism as reconstruction. So, Adam was not present for the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, but he takes you there, man. You feel like you're in the room. You can smell the radiation. And that's a really important skill that I learned a lot from, because I was not in the bunker in those first days of the invasion. I reconstructed those critical, some of those critical moments that are in the book. Many of them I witnessed and I was there for them, but a lot of them, especially the ones down in the bunker, I had to reconstruct them from people's from interviews, from people's recollections, and Adam does that so effectively from his interviews, from archival material. So I love that book, and it's been a great lesson to me in how to do those kinds of reconstructions that make the reader feel like they're there. They're present for these historic events.
Today I've been talking to Simon Shuster about The Showman, published today by HarperCollins. Simon, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the editor of the New Books Network. And here at the NBN, we use an account called Wise, and I'd like to encourage you to check it out. It's an account that helps you manage your money all around the world. So if you're dining in dollars, doing business in baht, the Wise account helps you send, spend, and receive in different currencies very fast. Wise is the easy way to connect all your finances internationally. Freelancing in France? No problem. Sending money back to mom? Simple, without hidden fees or exchange rate markups. Wise does it all. Join 16 million customers and learn how the Wise account could work for you by downloading the app or visiting wise.com/books. That's wise.com/books.